With the mantra of the happy days are here again, FDR was swept into office over Herbert Hoover in 1932, promising a New Deal and speaking for the forgotten man, despite the fact that there was really no coherent plan that he had to offer, just simply that he was going to provide more action than Herbert Hoover had done. Of course, even though Hoover had done the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Agricultural Marketing Act, the lasting vision that people had of Hoover was telling his army to burn the bonus expeditionary force marchers out of Washington, D.C., burning up their camp at Anacostia Flats, Maryland. So again, the perception of Hoover was cold and insensitive, despite the fact that I would argue he did more than any president had ever actually done during moments like this. Now, when you think about what FDR was doing coming in, he'd been a governor of New York, but he brought out a group called the Brain Trust or the Brains Trust, this liberal elite who came basically from Ivy League universities who were going to put their plan into action. But more than any specific plan, what FDR was really trying to inject was confidence and improve the morale of the American people. Now, he's going to do this through any number of different alphabet soup agencies, but at the end of the day, it's hard to measure the success of the New Deal without taking into account how much confidence he renewed in the American people. Now, he famously said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And what he means by that is it's time to stop throwing a pity party, because the more you get down on what's going on, the harder it's going to be to really pull yourself out. Now, he was not one of those people that was going to really sort of say, do this, and then not connect with the people. So through his fireside chats, he connected with everybody in America, or at least that was his goal. And of course, he started his first fireside chat by talking about banking, something that was not terribly sexy, but something he wanted Americans to understand so that he could get the economy moving again. So what he called was the bank holiday, and this was 4 days where the Treasury Department came in and checked out all the banks to make sure that they were okay and opened up most of them. And after 4 days and this sort of imploring of the American people to understand that they couldn't hoard their money, that they needed to put it back into the bank so that it could get out in circulation again, you saw about 3/4 of the banks open up, and you saw $1 billion in money that had been stored under the bed coming back into the banks to help the economy get going again. Now, presidents currently are really measured by what they do in their first 3 months. In FDR's first 100 days, he had a pliable Democratic Congress, both House and Senate, and they were both very willing to okay what Roosevelt was proposing. Now, again, I'm not going to go into the New Deal agencies, but it is important to know that in that first 100 days, you saw monumental change. You saw your CCC, sure it's optional. You saw your AAA for the farmers. You saw your TVA for hydroelectric power in that poor region. And then you saw the NRA, which of course is about sacrifice of businesses and again, the improvements that came for labor. Now, of course, I'm going to skip over the big 6 agencies that we'd already covered, and it's going to find me talking about banking. Now, not only did you have that bank holiday, but you also had something known as the Glass-Steagall Act, which is actually still around today. And what it's trying to do is give government control to make sure that banks themselves are not making bad investments. That was actually one of the problems that we saw in the stock market crash, is that many banks had invested their customers' money in stocks, and that's great when it's going up, but then when it actually goes bad, you lose people's savings. You're also going to have something called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or we know it as FDIC. And anytime you walk into a bank, you know that if you put your money in there, it's going to be safe, or it's going to be guaranteed up to a certain amount. And originally it was $2,500, then it's gone up to $5,000 and $10,000. So again, it's giving people confidence to put their money back into the banks. Now, in terms of investing, which of course we saw with the stock market, you had the Truth and Securities Act, which says, you know what, if you buy a stock, it's going to be transparent, you're going to know what it's all about, so you don't have any fraudulent activity going on, nobody's misrepresenting. And then again, we have the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is still around today, which is the SEC. And now you're going to have a watchdog to make sure that the market is operating lawfully. And again, it was not just over speculation of the little guy that made the market go up and up and up and then really burst, but it was the fact that there were some pretty shady practices going on, and this was meant to curb those practices. Now, with such radical government change and regulation and oversight, there were bound to be people that disagreed with FDR. Again, it wasn't like he swept into office and it was unanimous, but there certainly were people that were very wary of what he was doing. And there's a group of wealthy Republicans and even some conservative Democrats, okay? It's going to tend to be people in the South who say, listen, you know what? You're going too fast. You're doing too much. Again, this is sort of, socialistic in terms of many of the policies. And so the American Liberty League came together and, they called his actions, particularly around the AAA and Social Security, to be government overreach. Of course, the Supreme Court did rule that the AAA was a bit of government overreach. Now, you had this organization. They were not terribly successful. They're only around for a couple years. But again, it shows the opposition to what FDR is doing. Now, there are three men who you need to know. And they weren't all like directly opposing FDR. At least two of them were, but one wasn't. Now, we're going to see a guy named Dr. Francis Townsend. And he's a guy you would have never heard of. He's a doctor from California. And he actually got 5 million people together. And he was articulating a vision of federal pensions for the elderly. Now, please remember, this is not Social Security. Social Security will be based on a similar idea, but this is not Social Security. His idea, as sort of idealistic and naive that it was, said any Americans that are over 60, if they retired, would get $200 per month. Okay, so $2,400 a year. But they had to be retired to, again, open up jobs for younger people, and they had to spend that money every month. So you got your $200, and you had to spend that $200, again, to keep money going for businesses. The problem is, where are you going to get that $200? So it was really unfeasible overall, but it did get many people on board to say, yeah, we want this plan because people were poor and people were old. And Social Security will be passed, and again, it's actually borrowing more from European models than it was from Townsend's plan, but old people will, quote-unquote, get taken care of in a way. Now, the next guy we're going to talk about, really a true demagogue, somebody who sort of whipped up the support of the people and in some ways was actually quite dangerous to what was going on, was a guy named Father Coughlin. Now, this is a guy from the suburbs of Detroit, actually a place called Royal Oak. He'd actually been on Roosevelt's side. And then about 1934, he really turned on him, and he used particularly anti-Semitic language to say that FDR was really in bed with Jewish bankers and he wasn't doing enough to help the little guy. Now, he was anti-communism, and he called Roosevelt a communist, yet at the same time, he was looking for the government to get involved in sort of some old-time populist ideas like the remonetization of silver. Who would have thought that would have come back? And then a national banking system, which is certainly something that we'd seen all the way going back to Botus and then all the way through something that Lincoln had proposed. Now, he was hoping to restore economic prosperity. Yeah, we get that. Most people were. But he had this vision that he called social justice, which was very anti-FDR. But again, he ended up getting censored because he was too anti-Semitic. Now, the last guy, and certainly the most colorful guy, somebody who you should spend more time looking up, was Senator Huey Long of Louisiana, known affectionately as the Kingfish. Now, this guy really operated in Louisiana like it was his own fiefdom. At one point, he was the governor, and then he was elected senator, and he held both offices at once. Now, he had this share our wealth plan, which sounds very, very Robin Hood-esque. They're basically going to take surplus money from the rich, they don't need it, and then you're going to give it to the rest of the population. And his idea was sort of every man a king. So the people at the bottom could live much more like the rich if you got originally $5,000 and then an annual wage of $2,500. Now, if you look at Townsend's plan, that was just giving you $200 a month. This is giving you far more, but it faced the same problem. The share our wealth society was unsustainable. Like, where are you going to get this money? And why would anybody agree to give away their money at the top or agree to get it taken away and given to the poor? Now, Long was a real threat to FDR. At least some people thought that he could, in fact, maybe wrest the Democratic nomination in 1936, but before that, he's shot, and so the colorful legacy of Huey Long goes away with that. Now, we didn't really get into it in class, but everything up to 1935 is sort of seen as the first New Deal, and everything after is known as the Second New Deal, and so sort of pieces of the Second New Deal are Social Security and the Big Bill, as it was known, the WPA. But it's important to recognize that in the Schechter case, we saw that the NRA was ruled unconstitutional, in part because it violated the whole idea that the federal government could only control interstate commerce, and the Schechter brothers were working intrastate. But in losing the NRA, you're going to lose that special Section 7A, which provided for collective bargaining, the holy grail for labor. Now, it's going to come back pretty quickly in something known as the National Labor Relations Act or the Wagner Act. It's really important to understand that NRA rises like an eagle, dies like a sick chicken, and I like to think of the Wagner Act as, again, rising like a phoenix. But the NLRA, or the Wagner Act, created the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB, which is certainly still around today. And now you're going to actually have the enforcement mechanism for collective bargaining, which under the original NRA, it severely lacked, okay? Now, following that idea of labor and labor getting power, you're actually going to see sort of the last of the labor unions that we're going to talk about. And it's known as the CIO. And actually today, it's the AFL-CIO. But it's important to recognize that we talked about Samuel Gompers as the one name you need to know for the AFL. Well, you need to know one other name, and that is John Lewis. John Lewis is famous for his eyebrows, which are amazing caterpillars, but also for this idea of industrial unionism. Now, Gompers had believed in something called craft unionism, getting only skilled workers and very exclusive as opposed to the Knights of Labor. But Lewis proposed industrial unionism, where all workers in a single industry should be organized. So you're going to have all the auto workers as opposed to sort of breaking it up by skilled and unskilled. The AFL didn't like this, but the CIO started as part of the AFL, and then they sort of go off on their own, and then they're going to come back and actually sort of be equal partners. But what's important to know is that the CIO was basically the Knights of Labor Part 2. They were far more inclusive. So they're going to recruit women, African Americans. They're going to try to get into industries that typically the other exclusive unions hadn't been part of, like textiles, laundries, tobacco, sort of lower income. And they also tended to be much more militant, much more predisposed to strike. And famously, they figured out a way to really gain leverage, because that's the name of the game. So it wasn't just collective bargaining, which was an improvement. They created the sit-down strike, or at least they pioneered it. And I've talked about this in the past. They sat inside the plants, basically not working and refusing to leave. Now, again, this only works if you're able to have people on the outside that are protesting for you, bringing you food. So in this case, it was their wives, their daughters, their aunts, their moms. And so, again, they help this going, and you're going to see at the GM plants in the greater Detroit area, for 3 months, they, quote-unquote, occupy the plants. And in doing so, even though Michigan, in the past, you would have seen state governments, even federal governments, calling in the army, calling in state troops to break it, the Michigan governor refused to do so. The federal government also refused to do so, and GM gives in. So this sit-down strike showed that labor could have major leverage. And again, when times are good, labor does bad. When times are bad, labor does well. And we're going to see that again in World War II, and then basically after that, it's going to be the end of labor power. So in the midst of this second New Deal in 1936, FDR destroys this guy, Alf Landon, and he's only in his second term now, but he's thinking, man, I am amazing. Sort of got this, people are claiming he sort of got this Andrew Jackson sort of king complex. And he looks at the Supreme Court and he says, you know what? You guys have rejected the NRA, which of course came back, and you rejected the AAA, which also is going to come back. But he says, you know what? I want them to not stand in the way. And what you tended to see on this court of 9 is you had 3 people that were always for him, 4 people against, and you had 2 swing justices. So you never knew where they were going to go. So he proposes this sort of cockamamie plan where he says, I'm going to ask Congress, because Congress has this ability, to give me 6 new justices. So it would go from 9 to 15. He claims that they need this, they're overworked. And so his famous court packing plan was pretty much not only rejected by Congress, but rejected by the public and saying, no, you've gone too far. Yet at the end of the day, the 2 swing votes afterwards started actually going for him, so it ended up being 5-4, and that was good for programs like Social Security, which people thought would go in front of the Supreme Court and maybe lose.